All right.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. So, how do you solve a problem like social media? We're still talking about this. It's 2024. Joe, I'm going to start with you. There's been some news overnight on your old boss, Mr. Elon Musk, now in charge of... This isn't strictly a social media question, but it's topical, so I'm going to ask it quickly and we'll get past it. Like, what do you think Elon will do as the new head of the Department of Government Efficiency in the US?
Well, first, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first web summit, so this is a great kickoff, and I'm really excited. I know that we'll get to it later to talk about the New York Stock Exchange and everything that we're doing to really power and become an information pipeline really to every platform out there. But you asked a really good question. It's very topical. I think if you look at the constellation of companies that Elon is overseeing, you know, you have Tesla, you have SpaceX. These are long companies that have worked with governments in a variety of ways. You have Tesla that's working on safety compliance. You have SpaceX that's working on regulatory processes and a lot of federal contracts. Elon's been very big on and public around the need for AI regulation, and as the owner of X and working with the EU Commission and governments around the world. So I think if you put all of that together and that collective insight, I think it stands to have a really meaningful impact, and I think more so just in tech, but across all industries.
But do you think the U.S. government the infrastructure of U.S. government can withstand the kind of cuts that he made at X when he came in and bought the company?
Well, that's to be determined. I mean, I don't know what's in his plan or within their proposal, but I do think that understanding the efficiencies that have probably come from working with Tesla and SpaceX will have a very meaningful impact, and I think that is the type of expertise and knowledge that you'd want to impart within the administration.
Okay. Pamela, we've had a few elections this year. The oversight board was created. The Meta oversight board was created back in 2016 or 2017 after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Do you feel like Meta, after all this time, has learned from those past mistakes? Well, how did it conduct itself this time around?
No, thank you, and it's wonderful being with you guys on stage. I think we have to see the impact that Meta has had, that social media platforms in general have had on elections in its different varieties, and the positive impact as a way to empower people to communicate, to access information that is absolutely necessary for a democratic process. But also, when you look at the harms that you can have, the capacity to polarize, to incite, to coordinate, to incite violence, or to mislead in order to get political gain, to mislead users in order to undermine democracies. All of that has to be seen together. And when we were heading into the year of elections, because there has in fact been quite a bit of elections during this year, we were all concerned about how our social media platforms, and from the oversight board, how is Meta going to deal with these elections? Are they going to learn from the past lessons? Are they going to learn from what the mistakes that they had made? And I think that if we see throughout the elections that have occurred all the cycle, we have seen things that we would always expect not to happen in democracies, and even in not so democratic countries that have had elections. But that we have not had, up to today, a scandal that has to do with the role that social media platforms are playing on elections, especially the role that Meta is playing. And I think that has to do with the fact that it had been preparing for these elections, for this election cycle for a long time. And from the board, we've been pushing into the different measures that they had to have in place in order to guarantee transparency, to have metrics to evaluate their electoral integrity efforts, in order to not allow content, to act quickly on content that could incite violence, but to protect political speech that is absolutely necessary for a democracy to move forward.
Do you think that was related to how Meta effectively tried to sort of deprioritize political content in discourse on its platforms? Is that abdicating its responsibility as a sort of town square?
I think that there's two things that we have to understand. One, what does the deprioritizing of political content mean? It means it won't be amplified. It doesn't mean it won't be spread organically.
Right.
It just won't be amplified. It won't be fed in news feeds or in recommendation algorithms. There's a lot to question there because of the impact that can have in the possibility of people organizing, of people accessing information. We had a case in the Oversight Board regarding Venezuela and the protests in Venezuela, and we called out on Meta to really think of what impact that could have, for example, in protests or in oppositions that are trying to get their message out in criticism towards governments or other political parties that are participating in elections. That is something that I think has to be assessed, but we have to be clear on what it means to deprioritize that political content, because any content that is organically out there, any account that any one of our, or page that any one of us follows, we will be able to get that political content. If we follow newspapers, we will be able to get that political content. But it just will not be fed to users, and there's a lot of discussion to be had around that, I think.
Okay. Mark, what do you think the new US administration, what kind of impact do you think that will have on how the social media platforms conduct themselves and think about content moderation?
You know, it's interesting. And also, thank you guys. My first time up on the stage at Web Summit. And I've got a new book, Restoring Our Sanity Online, that our dear comrade, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, heartily endorsed as sharing the vision. And here's what's happening. So, you know, first of all, Meta sort of pulled back, right? Because Donald Trump several months ago said, you know, I'm going to put Mark Zuckerberg in jail if I'm elected president. He said that in July. And 3 days later, Meta took all the sort of guardrails off of Trump, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars spent, you know, on Meta, but, you know, paid for it during the political campaign season. So it's not as though there was no boosted content. There was paid, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars from all sides. But what happens now is, if you look at what is unprecedented in America, Trump's, you know, reach through social media, his influence through social media, through X, through his site, Truth Social, and of course through his cozy relationship with Fox. For a sitting American president to have that kind of you know, reach just via social media is unprecedented. So what we're going to see is, without having to pay, so to speak, to pay to boost all these things, you know, we're going to see that Trump will be able to promote, you know, his agenda through, you know, through social in unprecedented ways. But we'll probably see is there is an antitrust case in the U.S. government, you know, that's been working through for 3 years, and I've been part of it. I've been subpoenaed by the Federal Trade Commission. I've been deposed by Meta. I've been deposed by the U.S. government. I've provided hundreds of pages of documentation around what I know about it. And I believe that you will see the Trump administration likely to support that case moving forward. And in this case, if that case moves forward and there's, you know, maybe we get lucky and we get data interoperability, data portability, where we can really get the free market working again, because the free market doesn't work right now for personal social media, which is sites like Facebook, of which there are very few. Where you're connected with your family and your friends, in addition to all the news and all the pages and groups. Yep. So I think we're seeing both.
Joe, can I just, do you agree that if you know, Trump uses X as his de facto government communications machine, will that bring brands back? Does the New York Stock Exchange want to play in that kind of environment as a partner to a brand that's so closely allied to a particular political viewpoint?
So let me unpack. I think you asked two questions.
Sure.
You probably asked a third that's buried in there. But I think, you know, kind of putting together both things that were discussed in terms of leveraging these platforms and leveraging X, I think that you probably saw both administrations leverage all platforms, and you may have seen, you know, one administration use one over the other depending on their constituencies and their bases. And so I think that's probably a healthy digital ecosystem. But the second part of your question was around brands.
Yeah.
And
the FT had a story, my colleagues at the FT this morning had a story saying that brands are actually coming back to X, partly because they feel like they want to cozy up to the Trump administration.
Well, I mean, and that's a brand decision, and that's something that, I can't speak to. I can speak to the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange does have its content on every platform, and that's a good thing because we do reach a wide-ranging constituents, and business audiences are on every platform. So for brands to say that they want to do that specifically on the X platform is a great thing then for X and its monetization.
But so do you kind of, I mean, a brand like the New York Stock Exchange is, I think of as relatively, you're a very traditional kind of brand. You're not a kind of racy, fast-moving new consumer goods business that's trying to start up on social media. Does that kind of change? I mean, you've worked with brands for many years. Does that have a different kind of texture to how they would engage with social media? You have a new role to do exactly that, right?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that, because in my specific role, it's to create a pipeline of information to every single one of the platforms. So if you think about the thought leadership and the business acumen that comes from the New York Stock Exchange. Just look at the New York Stock Exchange just in a couple data points. $40 trillion. $40 trillion is the market cap of the 2,400 listed companies that are on the stock exchange. In addition to that, those companies employ 43 million people around the world. So if you look at that and you think about all of the platforms and all of their communities, then there's definitely communities on every single one of those platforms by which would be very interested in the thought leadership and the business acumen and the financial perspective that's coming out of the New York Stock Exchange. So definitely all platforms are of high consideration, and we're in conversation with all of them, including X. In fact, I just had a really great conversation with the X team just last week, and we're thinking about what we will do and to rev up our partnership.
Okay. When you were working there and you left this summer,
Right.
So before the kind of election campaign really ramped up, I guess, but did you see any sign that Elon was using the X algorithm to amplify posts that he agreed with, to sort of amplify conservative views?
No.
No?
No. I think that, the platform by and large is preserving free speech for all diverse voices, and that's the work that platform is doing, and you can actually see it in all of the work. I know that the current election is one specific endpoint as it relates to free speech, but if you look at the platform and you look at its transition from Twitter to X, new company, new value proposition, but you look at its work in Brazil, you look at its work in Australia, and I know that there's a lot going on in Australia. You look at the platform's work in India, you definitely can see that the protection of free speech is baked into all of those different efforts. So I think the current U.S. election is one very specific input that you see. You see a lot of voices able to emerge and able to have the ability to engage in an election process.
Pamela, do you feel like it would be a problem if a proprietor of a social media platform was using that sort of algorithm to promote their views? I mean, we've had newspaper barons using their politics in print for decades.
I think that if there's one thing that we have to hold social media platforms accountable for, is to be transparent as to their design decisions, what they're amplifying, what they're demoting, what they're not showing people, what is moving organically and what is being boosted by the platform. I think there's a difference when we're talking about advertisements, because advertisements are that. They're paid propaganda that is moving, and it can occur in social media platforms, or it can occur in other traditional media, etc., where you pay for something to be pushed. But when there's an algorithm that actually is continually showing something to people, that is continually pushing to have amplified the certain information beyond the reach that would have because of the amount of followers you have, for example, then there should be clarity on that, because you can be promoting certain narratives. We saw it, for example, in Brazil. You could see coordinated campaigns in Brazil trying to contest the results of the election, but not only that, call for violence and call for the taking over of the Three Power Plaza, which actually occurred. And those were coordinated campaigns using the social media platforms. Though it's true that there have been efforts by some social media platforms to stop some of these coordinated campaigns, especially when they're inauthentic, especially when you have bots, it is also true that these are still occurring and they have enormous impacts. And what we have to hold platforms accountable for is for transparency at the minimum, at the least on this. And I believe that if social media platforms today have a lot of say in what we see, what we hear, and the information, the political information we get. So long as you have more social media platforms being like the vehicle for political information, we have to hold all the social media platforms accountable. Meta decided, for reasons that had to do with Cambridge Analytica, that had to do with scandals that occurred in those ages, decided to create an oversight board. But today, they do have an oversight board that actually holds them accountable, that is independent from them, that doesn't act on behalf of their political interests or their business interests, and that fleshes out the problems that we identify and tries to find solutions for those problems. Other platforms don't have that, and we're not holding them accountable to be transparent into what we see, what we hear, and why, and how they're functioning. And I think that if there's something that everybody has to work around, is making social media platforms accountable, because you have private actors really controlling our fundamental liberties and our fundamental freedoms.
One of the things that I think the Oversight Board was warning about as we went into this election season around the world was the use of deep fakes to kind of think. I mean, that didn't seem to be, I don't know, have you seen that become the problem that it was feared to be, or was it overhyped? Was it controlled properly? What happened?
We all feared that this year of election, because we had like two things together: a year of enormous amount of elections and a year of a boost of AI. So it was, if you put these two together in a mix, this can be like a recipe for disaster. But what happened? We have not seen an explosion of that in these elections. Does that have to do with the fact that social media platforms are enforcing better and controlling better what is on their platforms? I would doubt it, because we would see differences in different platforms, and we're not seeing that. I would think that what we're seeing is that it is not being used yet. Does it mean it won't be used? Of course, we saw an enormous rise in deepfakes in this election cycle vis-a-vis prior election cycles. But we didn't see the hype that we were expecting, and for it to like overrun our capacity to understand what was real, what was not real during an election. Yep. But we still have to be aware, and the guardrails still have to be put in place.
Okay. Mark, I mean, arguably a bigger problem with deepfakes is areas like non-consensual pornography or child abuse imagery that's being used, being made with AI. What do you feel like the regulators' response on child safety online has been so far? And we've seen this new proposal from the Australian government to ban social media for under 16s outright. Is that workable? Is that the right approach?
You know, and you guys may be familiar with this. The Australian government now, the Prime Minister has said that he's about to introduce legislation to make a mandatory minimum age of 16 for children to be on social media, and with user ID verification. Now, in my book, Restoring Our Sanity Online, I talk about user ID verification because we've got to do something for kids. We have to protect the anonymity of, you know, those at risk, whistleblowers, things like that. But we've really got to get our kids protected. And all of us, you know, civil discourse and democracy are at much greater risk than we're talking about up here. Because when you've got, you know, even half of Elon Musk's followers, according to Time magazine, half of his 200 million followers are bots and trolls. So while free speech is important, if it's bots and trolls and nefarious actors in adversarial countries that are perpetrating this bots and troll, overreach on these platforms and making us hate each other when we really don't hate each other, we've got a problem. And for kids, we've got to protect their mental health. We've got to get them stable again. We know that the screen is addictive. We know that the algorithms that keep all of us addicted on social media are now supercharged by AI. So, you know, it's not just about political content, it's about all content. The AI can do A/B testing in nanoseconds, and we all know people who are completely addicted to our screens. In fact, some of us in the audience today, right? So I think the Australian government is taking an interesting approach. I think 16 personally, is just not workable in a country like the United States. So I'm an advocate for 13. I'm an advocate for figuring out very good systems like Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, has a new system for user ID verification also, where we can just make sure that kids are talking to kids, that they really are 13 if they're on Facebook and other places, and that we can get them no boosted content, no targeted, no advertising, all this stuff until they're 18. We've got to protect kids.
Joe, I mean, do you feel like everything that's been tried is with child safety, can the platforms be trusted to regulate themselves at this point? You were involved in this at X.
Yeah, so during my time at X, which was actually a very prideful moment, and I spent a lot of time at Meta, but specifically at X, I mean, the platform itself had put a ton of effort. In fact, that was one of the very first things that, or very first kind of policy overview that Linda and I reviewed when we got there in June of last year, in June of 2023. And they had done they had made a step change in all of their enforcement. And in fact, they actually supported, I think, up to 5 pieces of legislation with, the Report Act, with the SHIELD Act, COSA, and, I think when you look at platforms leaning in to legislation, the Report Act, in fact, actually became law. That's, in fact, when you're holding each other accountable. And that's what you want to see. You want to see tech platforms working with governments more closely, and not just in the US. You want to see that happening around the world, because what you want to make sure is that you're making a sweep and a step change. And I actually know that from that platform, they actually had 10 times more enforcement than they did when it wasn't owned.
Okay. Last question for you, Pamela, very, very quickly. I mean, do you think that child safety is a solvable problem online, or is the best thing just to kind of put an alcohol-style age limit on it?
I think that we have to work to protect children, but also to give voice to children, to be able to empower and give them agency, and to find the balance. This is something that we will not achieve only through regulation. There has to be a combination between regulation and self-regulation, through accountability mechanisms, through independent oversight. If we don't get all of this together, we will always be a step behind, because regulation is not fast, it's not fast to approve, and it's not fast to implement.
Okay. This panel has gone very fast, though. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to boil this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.